Wow, Roy's pretty much covered everything. As he says, yes, I'm a recovering dev. I did a degree in psychology, believe it or not. I fell into development and then I fell quickly back out of development after about 2 years. And I've returned home to psychology. But I miss code and I can't help myself from not writing my thesis and messing around with WordPress. So who knew? So yeah, as he says, I'm a PhD researcher at Drakett University alongside lecturing in psychology. And I got very interested in the gender gap when I was seeing women starting and leaving the company that I worked at with worrying frequency. And when I was working as one of, I think when I left I was one of 5 out of a team of about maybe 60 or so, is that right, Martin? So yeah, that's the kind of thing that spurred me on to apply for the PhD funding at Drakett. Amy's pretty helpfully already talked a little bit about some of the stats, but just in case people weren't aware, it's not just an issue in industry, it's an issue in education as well. So across all subjects in higher education, women account for over half of applications and acceptances, but narrow that down to computer sciences subjects and we're looking at 12% of applications and 13% of acceptances. And this issue is not just limited to the UK, it's an issue across all EU 15 nations, and representation of women in IT industry-wise is lower in the UK than it is for the EU average. So why jokes and banter? The thing for me was seeing a lot of high-profile examples of sexism in the media being passed off as just jokes. So Sarah Rutherford is a diversity consultant. She regards banter as a catch-all word for all kinds of office talk, characterised usually by humour and an undercurrent of teasing in a good-natured way. And it's that good-natured way that I want you all to kind of bear in mind. Because banter tends to be very, very gendered. There's a lot of violence in there. There's a lot of sports and war metaphors, which it could be argued, serve to exclude or marginalise women. And the danger of passing things off as calling them jokes is it makes it, it makes it acceptable, it sanitises it somehow. So you can say something that is absolutely appallingly offensive, that genuinely hurts somebody, and then go, oh, well, you need to get a sense of humour, laugh it off. Because a sense of humour is, of course, something that we all, are required to have. The particular example I wanted to bring up tonight was Dell actually, I think it was 2012, had a conference speaker at, I think it was Belgium. It was one of the European conferences. They'd hired a notoriously controversial speaker, and he took to the stage and addressed the lack of women in the room as something that he was glad about. He encouraged the women in the room to go home, to get back in the kitchen, and pointed out that we can thank men for all the great inventions in technology, where we can thank women for inventing the rolling pin. Obviously, this didn't go down too well. The internet was very angry en masse. Dell apologised. They drew attention to the good work that they do in terms of promoting diversity as a company, but ultimately it was passed off and excused as being just a joke. People need to lighten up. So I got thinking about humour. In particular, a type of humour that is uniquely tied to technology, and that is internet memes. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that everybody in this room knows what internet memes are. Yeah? Cool. Because I spent the best part of a year and a half explaining to academics what internet memes were, and that is not something I can recommend as a fun task. So I wanted to expand on current research around internet memes that tends to be based in sort of mathematics and networking fields. So they're really, really interested in when a meme's going to get super popular, when it's going to crash, how it's going to mutate and spread. But there was nothing actually looking at the content of the humour, so who the targets of the jokes were, what the memes were actually doing in terms of the language. So I came up with a sampling strategy that somehow got through our ethics and research boards. I managed to download 240 image macro format internet memes from popular websites that allowed creation and sharing and so on. These were coded using a piece of software called NVivo, which qualitative researchers use to kind of help categorise and tag things. It's a fancy database with a nice front end. And obviously, as a feminist, these were analysed from a feminist standpoint. I'm not going to go too into the results of this study tonight, because I think I'm more interested in talking about women actually in technology, but this is important for some bits of context. So the two themes that came out of the large analysis of internet memes were this idea of technological privilege. So these memes were about the internet and technology. For example, there'd be something like, you know, the conspiracy Keanu one where he's kind of looking a bit confused, saying, what if Internet Explorer is really shit because nobody ever sends an error report? So it's assuming that you've got that base level of knowledge about Internet Explorer and how shit it is. Then there's also memes about memes. So these would use the sort of rules and conventions of memes to actually sort of create the humour. So they'd twist the catchphrases, they'd rewrite them, they'd rework them, that sort of thing. And then there's the last aspect of that, which I'm still to this day not entirely sure what was going on. Sexy geeks. Loads of maths and science jokes, always with weird sexual innuendo. Just kind of uncomfortable and creepy. The other theme is not so imaginatively titled, and it is others. Basically, anybody that fell outside of that sort of very technologically privileged identity created in the first theme was fair game to have the piss ripped out of them, basically. The focus here today is on women as other. So women's sexuality was fair game, women's appearances were fair game. There was jokes about domestic violence, child abuse, sexual abuse. A lot of things sort of reiterating things that women are or women say, you know, like one does not simply win an argument with a woman. And the interesting thing in terms of positioning women and men with technology here was that men were shown to be creating, they were using, they were showing off, they were doing very, very interesting things. They were downloading music illegally and watching porn and, you know, hacking things. Women were complaining that their diamond earrings had scratched their iPhones, or perhaps that Facebook was running slow, or they were being mocked for using Facebook, something that's arguably a lot more mainstream. So, take-homes of that, construction of a very, very specific ideal identity, a very prized identity, policing of any sort of possible alternative to that identity. This was gendered, as I've just said, and they were using very, very established techniques to create humour. So traditional humour research, stuff that looks at, say, I don't know, political cartoons or long format email jokes. You know, the one about upgrading boyfriend 1.0 to husband 2.0, these kind of things. There's been studies done on that already. And we saw the same kind of techniques being used in the memes to create the humour. So you're using the visuals, the puns, the repetition, the kind of punchlines. I'm still not entirely sure if this is entirely a negative or a positive thing, but the memes being rule-based creates a kind of community element there. So there's potential to argue that memes are exclusionary. They're simply not for everybody. You have to understand a lot and spend a lot of time sort of being up on the rules and conventions to get them. But I'm wondering if perhaps they're also inclusionary in that aspect, in that they're creating a safe space and a very easy set of rules for somebody who might otherwise not be able to get a laugh very, very easily. So that's memes. The more exciting study. Study 2. Thanks, Royd. Women in tech speak. So the original plan, as I'm sure Royd is painfully aware, was to have 6 groups, each with 6 women, 6 focus group sessions, 2 groups of women currently working in IT, 2 with women who left IT, and 2 with students wanting to get into IT. Recruitment was super difficult in spite of the help that I had from such as Royd and other gatekeepers in the community, contacts that I had myself through my previous role, university sort of course leaders and so on. In fact, university course leaders was the most depressing thing because they were absolutely perfectly helpful and they were like, yeah, we'll totally pass on your recruitment info, but there's only 3 girls on our course, so when those 3 girls don't have time, you know, it makes it very, very difficult for me. So the final count was 27 women, which is a small sample, I'm aware, for any super science, hardcore science people in here, but I'm a qualitative researcher, please bear with me. 22 of those women were currently working in IT. 3 of them had left the industry, and 2 were students in their final years working towards a career in IT. But they were quite interesting in that they'd also had a placement year, so they had some exposure to the industry, if you like. I used a mixture of focus groups, dyads and interviews because of this sort of weird number breakdown that we ended up with. The interviews were semi-structured. I had a sort of loose schedule asking questions about how they first got into the industry, what they liked, you know, what they enjoyed about their jobs, how they experienced their interactions with their colleagues, how their friends and family, strangers reacted when they found out what they did. And then I also did sort of half a session exploring humour and the results of the internet meme stuff that I'd done in study 1. For most of the sessions, because a couple of them managed to actually overrun because the women got so into discussing humour and shouting at each other, which was fantastic, most of them had the opportunity to rewrite internet memes. So I took blank meme templates and said, okay, so this is what the memes are saying. Do you want to have a go at rewording them? And there was a mix of uptake on this. After hours and hours and hours of transcription, and finally, you know how you hate your own voice when you hear it back? I'm beyond that point now. I've listened to myself for so long that I'm totally happy with it. Transcription and then analysis using feminist post-structuralist discourse analysis, which probably means nothing to anybody who's not a critical psychologist. But if you'd like to look it up, Willett and Griffin's 1997 paper, Wham Bam, Am I a Man, is fantastic, and not just for its title. The analysis revealed 2 overarching broad discourses. And the first one I'm not going to be focusing on tonight, but this saw a dissolving of gender in technology and for technology workers, whereas the second discourse was working to construct IT as a toxic boys' club, which I'm aware, this seems like a bit of a downer after Amy's lovely sort of cheerful talk, but I'll try and get some of the nice bits there as well. So discourse 1, just sort of have it in the back of your mind, gender is dissolved in technology. And I'm going to summarise this using one of my most hated phrases over the past couple of years, and that is, lean in! Because if we all just lean in and work hard enough, we can have whatever we want, right? Apart from all those societal and structural issues that we're ignoring by, reinforcing this discourse. The problem here is this really individualises the responsibility for women and completely ignores any other sort of issues that might be going on. It renders gender issues in the workplace completely unspeakable by buying into this sort of neoliberal and post-feminist idea that, we've won, call it off, we're equal pay, and so on. Or there's some stuff in here about equality by numbers, as I'm calling it. So I'd never actually asked the women how many men and women worked there, but every single group I'd say, so tell me a little bit about the environment at work. And it'd be like, oh, there's 3 women and there's 17 men. And it was almost as if that's the only way we physically see equality in terms of like, oh, I can see that there are 3 women and I can see that there are 17 men, so that's different. Maybe if there were 10 women and 10 men, then we'd be done. But sorry, I'm digressing. This isn't the one that I want to talk about tonight. So discourse 2. IT as a toxic boys' club, and this is potentially going to be an uncomfortable discourse for some people, but I think it's important that we sort of pay attention to some of the data extracts that I'm going to be presenting tonight. This was a massive discourse. I do not have time to present all the aspects of it tonight, so I've tried to trim it down, and thankfully there's some mapping onto Amy's stuff, which is quite nice. It's almost as if we're psychic. And this focuses on constructions of IT workers and IT work itself. There's a myriad of things in this. So talk around mental health, talk around maternity, talk around geek identity and what that is, what that looks like, how to handle humour, and overall the absolutely exhausting non-stop work that is done in order to justify for most of these women their sort of place in this industry. So the first aspect I'm going to present 2 tonight is, who are you? Inside and outsiders constructing identity and work. So when I say insiders, I mean women working in technology and other people sort of that they work with. Outsiders for this purpose is anybody who's maybe not working in technology. So that might be extended family, friends, maybe clients that they're working with who aren't sort of directly with them. And I'm going to look at how the sort of perhaps rarefied geek identity sort of takes hold. I'm going to apologise now, super text heavy, but bear with me, I'm just going to kind of read them out and try and not do too many weird voices. So, Catherine, you can spot when you're like in a city you've never been to before and you're going to a conference, you can spot other people who are going to the conference like, yeah, off the train, you go on the train going, that guy's in the conference, that guy's going to the conference, even though you're going to like Cardiff or something. So people could be on the train for any reason, but you can't talk to them though. No, God, talk to strangers. No. Helen, it's like being a woman at a tech conference is like the only person not using a Mac at a tech conference. Like, you know, the stereotype is strong with developers. Hoodies and jeans, swag t-shirts, Macs. I've met everyone I know through the work that I'm doing. It's not the whole kind of bedroom coder, guy, antisocial, you know, Cheeto-stained fingers, whatever. It's still there and it's all right, but that's not what it is. And if you're at a company where that is what it is, then you shouldn't stay. So already you can see this sort of tension here with the women sort of reproducing these very particular constructions of what it means to be a geek, arguably very masculinized, but also distancing themselves from it. I think that this distancing is something that's really, really important here. So, Kelly, like most IT environments, it's very blokey. Well, I say very blokey, it's very geeky blokey. So it's not like, no, it's not that geeky blokey though. It's not. Yeah, maybe, I don't know, because I've only been around a little while, because they're not as geeky as I expected. So I'm curious at this point, what do you mean when you say geeky blokey? Well, I don't know, they talk about sports. Ugh! And Jenna. And you've got the geeky blokes who do all the development and that sort of thing, the project teams, and that was the sort of difference between the two. And in the last few years, I've noticed that the geekiness isn't there so much. And there's a lot more trendy people knocking around, you know, they're walking about slightly fashionable. And I thought that the tension in these particular extracts was really, really interesting. A researcher, pair of researchers, Margolis and Fisher, worked on this idea of the Geek mythology paradox. And I want to point out that this book is like 15 years old or something. But the Geek mythology paradox questioned computer science students about what they saw the typical computer science student was. And men and women would all draw on these very typical sort of, you know, Cheeto-stained fingers, isolated kind of constructions, but would also very, very quickly work to distance themselves from it. So they'd say, a geek is like the drawing in Amy's presentation, but that's not me. You know, they were very, very quick to highlight the fact of, you know, that they had more social interests, that tech wasn't all their life revolved around. But the really interesting thing was women were more likely to distance themselves from these constructions, and in these spaces, women were more damaged by these constructions because the sort of lower identification, if you like, with this identity led them to question their legitimacy in these spaces. And they start questioning their belonging and whether or not they should be there and whether or not they're capable or legitimate workers. And you see similar things in other organisational literature where a masculinized identity is ideal. And I would argue that a geek identity, though perhaps counter to a more sort of normative masculinity, is just another form of masculinity. It is so wrapped up in masculinity that women just don't stand a chance. Like, they are completely counter to this ideal. So outsiders, for the most part, didn't get tech work, as Amy's pointed out. They don't understand what it entails. And this has damaging effects for everybody, not just women, because I'm starting to think a little bit recently about the impacts on sort of mental health. If the image of somebody working in IT is a bloke in a basement asking you to turn it off and on again, the reality of short projects and really harsh deadlines somehow gets a little bit lost in translation, and it makes, you know, complaining or questioning or advocating for better work conditions a little bit more difficult. But, Brooke, yeah, I think people thought it was odd that a woman could work in IT and do the hardware side of it. Yeah, I think people think of women in IT as working on help desks. Yeah, answering phones, logging calls, here's a reference number, like first line support. They don't think of a woman, doing third line, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, crawling about, steel toe cap boots, wiring things. Yeah. So you start to see that not only do they not have an idea about what the work entails, but they have a very specific and very gendered idea about the types of work that people are and are not allowed to sort of carry out. So Brooke was really interesting. She was one of the only sort of hardware-y type people that I spoke to. Dana as a dev. I think some people are surprised, but like strangers are surprised, like, oh, you're a woman, you're doing code. And this was one of the more upsetting ones for me. This was Ruby, one of the students. When you meet new people, like that's when, so like when I was on my placement or on my exchange year and I told them that I was studying, the first thing, and I hated that they said that, the first thing they would say was, I never would have guessed that looking at you. Sorry, the data's not great. Brooke. And there was, initially, I held a position of novelty value, really. People at work, I didn't know quite what to make of this sort of 23-year-old girl which had just turned up to do whatever, or it's got a printer in bits on the showroom floor. And at first there was lots of, do you know what you're doing? Or at first there was, have you got Tim's mobile number? I just need to ask him something about my computer. I think because generally computer science or software engineering or whatever is viewed as a subject that boys like to learn, and it's to some extent, I mean, I don't agree with it, but I get where they're coming from, because all these CEOs and all these tech founders, you know, company founders, they're men. And she goes on to say, the ones they get to see are men. So, you know, it can be surprising when they see a woman in this role. She doesn't agree, but she acknowledges this. And then Hannah, this one really winds me up so much. And you assumed, because I was a girl and answered the phone, that I was a receptionist. This Hannah is a PM. She's worked in various roles. I think there's not a role she's not been in, to be honest. She's currently a PM, or she was a PM when I conducted this. I answered the phone. I was a receptionist. That was your assumption. If I was a bloke and I answered the phone, you would not assume that he was a receptionist. You wouldn't. Just because I was a girl, and it really, really pisses me off when I get those calls. Like, they're like, oh, can I leave a message? Let me take your name. Oh, no. I just need to speak to so-and-so. And it's always one of the guys. And you're like... So we see here that there's another reiteration of the kinds of work that women are and aren't allowed to carry out in these spaces. However, that's been influenced by, you know, media examples of people in technology, whatever. But it's a reiteration of the fact that certain masculine identities are more prized, and this has a knock-on effect for the kinds of roles that women are allowed to carry out. So, for example, women are suited to support and answering phones and receptions. There's no space for a woman, as Brooke says, in steel toe-capped boots, crawling about in jeans, wiring a cabinet. It's just not something that, you know, can happen. And it's clearly extremely frustrating for the women that I spoke to. So I'm going to move on to the second aspect that I want to talk about tonight, which is playing the game. I'm going to be focusing sort of more on humour, but there's some crossover with the discourse one about playing the game in terms of the hours that women are expected to carry out. I'm not going to be touching on any of the maternity type stuff, and in fact I didn't actually ask the women about maternity or motherhood, but the majority of the groups did in fact bring it up in terms of blazing arguments about whether or not IT is or isn't suitable, drawing on a lot of the having it all actually meaning doing it all discourses that we tend to see. So I'm going to contrast two examples now. So this is Jenna. Sorry, one of them was in the desktop support team, because on the graduate scheme you get put in, so I had 6 months of desktop support, and I loved it. There was me and 13 men who were like the mechanics and whatnot, and when I got accepted to be one of the guys, that was brilliant. That was because then they were treating me the same as everybody else, rather than now pet, which is what I got when I very first joined, because they just saw this little girl who was maybe awfully intimidated by the swearing that was going on across the office. But when I showed that I could pull my weight and join in with the humour and all that sort of thing that I wanted to do, I was really pleased with that. And this one contrasts amazingly with Brooke's comments on this. So I like to come from the mindset of don't take offence, engage in banter, don't be princessy, and any sort of feminine, femaleness, you need to shove that to one side while you're at work, because if you don't, you're not going to last 5 minutes. She went on later to say, in the job I was doing, because I was never in one place all the time, I had to turn up very much with a ballsy attitude straight away. I'm here to do this today, and I've never met you before. Yes, you're right, I am a woman. yes, I'm a young woman, and you've never met me, and I know that you're stunned that I'm here to do this for you, but that's what I'm here to do. And it was a, if you can't beat them, join them attitude. And I had to reevaluate where the line in the sand was as far as banter and what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, which there were so many variables involved in doing that. It was like you had to risk assess every new dealership I went to and every new member of staff that I had to deal with on a one-to-one basis. So where Jenna's framing her playing the game, joining in, engaging in the banter, swearing with the mechanics as she constructs the rest of her team as something that she wanted to do, Brooke, on the other hand, is framing this as a matter of necessity. This is something she has to do almost as a protective strategy in order to continue working in this environment. There seems to be a sort of need to flatten the feminine. It's sort of subjugating and derogating very specific types of perhaps normative femininities because they fly in the face of the sort of prized masculine geek identity that we're seeing elsewhere. And this is something that you see in other areas of sort of organisational psychology where you're looking at male-dominated spaces. You find that this playing the game is absolutely essential for women and perhaps even lower status men, depending on sort of ranks and stuff. For example, Rutherford did work with the MOD that sees similar things. My PhD supervisor, Bridget, has done work with door supervisors, bouncers. And you see this kind of, you know, not even in terms of safety, but a complete rejection of sort of normal femininities. This don't be princessy, drawing on this princessy idea. You know, you can't do this. You have to be one of the boys. But unfortunately, they can never actually be one of the boys. They can only ever really play at being one of the boys. So, resistance is really, really, really tricky. So Catherine says, you do kind of get known as like the feminist though or something, don't you? Like, especially in an office full of guys and like, yeah, when you're the only girl. This was after she'd sort of discussed how every time her boss is about to say something sexist, he sort of peeps over his monitor to see if she's got her headphones in, see if she can hear him or not. So she's started this sort of war with taking her headphones out. But yeah, she now is known as the feminist of the office, and clearly there's some sort of negative associations with this that are being carried. And Kelly, but yeah, this certainly is about the context, and there's something that someone could say something to me, and if they knew me, I'd, you know, things, and it's like, you can be the person that gets crazy about it, and then no one, you know, you're off limits, and you're like the person that everybody has a chat and they don't want to offend you, so you're not part of that. So you can see here that resistance is either labelling you a feminist or being excluded, being isolated in a particular way. And Rutherford's work with the MOD sort of highlights there's a few different aspects of resistance. So women are expected to join in and play the game, whatever that might entail. If they ignore it, they'll be isolated. If they actively challenge it, so actively resisting it, they will be labelled spoil sport and then further isolated. However, joining in is not straightforward because you have to join in, but you have to self-monitor with that joining in. You can't fully join in because, as Coburn reminds us, what is funny coming from a man is obscene coming from a woman. So there's a constant sort of self-monitoring and a not going too far and, you know, don't push it too far. You know, you might be able to say one thing, but you can't say another thing. And sort of beyond this, resistance was talked about by these women in terms of what it might invite in terms of other behaviours. So Brooke, the hardware sort of third line type that I spoke to, is not currently working in IT anymore. She chalks her leaving IT down to the company she was working for being bought out by a large company and sort of not getting on with the sort of more corporate vibe, going from sort of a smaller family kind of vibe to a big corporate vibe. But Brooke also suffered a couple of relatively serious incidents during her time there. There was a sexual assault and there was another incident involving a colleague and some pornography. The following extracts deal with Brooke talking about how she eventually came to report these incidents. So I said, when I tell you, I'm going to be putting you in a difficult spot, because you now know, and so essentially I'm going to the wrong director, but you're the only person I can bring this to. I said, Drew, I can't go down the HR route. I'll just be blacklisted. I'll be blacklisted. Nobody, if I wanted to change jobs, because it's so incestuous, everybody knows. Everybody would know, oh, she's that girl from IT. She's the one that's proper potty-mouthed. And yeah, you can't have it both ways, can you? Fucking hell, these feminists, all blah, blah, blah. You know, what do they expect? And she followed this up, sort of following a little bit more questioning with, so like I say, the experience as an incident's fairly catastrophic. If I'd have been very girly, very feminine, hello, I'm here to fix your computer, there'd have been lots of minor incidents, I'm sure. So you can see again, you've got this sort of rejection of feminine, the sort of taking on of the sort of more prized masculine as a protective strategy almost. And it's still not worked. You know, she's still had these horrendous incidents happen to her. But resisting is extremely difficult because she has chosen to play the game. But what about memes? One does not simply analyse discussions of memes, as I have found. In terms of explicit talk around humour, memes kind of set the focus groups on fire. It was really, really fun for me, so I'm always happy to be disagreed with. To hear women arguing that they thought my analysis of the memes was fine and they could see where I was coming from, versus they thought it was useless and it was political correctness gone mad, and we are super hypersensitive as a culture and we should probably quit that. Memes have a place in technology from what I can tell, and there seems to be a blurring of the boundaries between physical and digital almost, in that there was a lot of talk about printouts and paintings and sort of using them in internal communications. So there's something going on there, I think, I hope, maybe. But the positive, because I kind of want to sort of push towards a more positive, on the idea of playing the game, it's possible to resist, perhaps through humour, and sort of twisting or reworking things is often maybe a safer way to do that for some of these women. I'm still trying to figure out, in terms of, I've mentioned this Coburn quote about what's funny coming from a man is obscene coming from a woman. I'm still trying to work out if there's something there in terms of tension around enjoyment of memes. So a lot of the women spoke about memes in terms of it almost being a guilty pleasure, or their inner feminist sort of gets angry with them for liking something or laughing at something. But I think the key thing was everybody brought up how context is important, not just in terms of humour, but not just in terms of memes, but in terms of humour more generally. It's context and it's prior relationship, and it's just generally not being a shitty person. Like, there's no fancy academic way to say that, I'm afraid. But this is something that the women did seem to want to sort of like push, was, you know, stop being shitty to each other. So from where I'm at currently, writing up in a room on my own, trying desperately to get the thesis in the next year, I see women facing many obstacles and sort of, they're in a precarious position. There's a constant sort of tight-roping of identity management, sort of constantly having to accept and reject this sort of geek identity, constantly having to play a game or not quite play a game, or maybe resist playing a game, or feel some sort of guilt or shame for challenging something or going along with something. And I would argue that, yes, there are aspects of the culture of technology that are contributing to this in a variety of ways. So from the hours to how people tend to communicate, to outsiders' views on technology, so not having any clue what is actually done in those workplaces. I'd argue that humour and memes are powerful, potentially in a good way, potentially in a bad way. But I like to finish on a positive, so I'd like to think that there's potential to use humour for good. And as I say, this is very much a work in progress, and I'm happy for feedback and a chat. Thank you. If you want to read.